It was not always easy for the United States to maintain its neutrality, and there were a number of episodes that pushed Wilson nearly to the brink of declaring war. There were difficulties, honestly, with both sides in this war. The British were not thrilled that the United States did not join them immediately and support their side in the war. And they weren't thrilled that the United States was trading goods with the other side. There were several incidents in which British naval forces stopped American ships. They enforced a blockade in the northern Atlantic that ensnared American ships at times. And yet it was with Germany that American interests really broke. The British may have occasionally stopped American ships and caused a little bit of trouble for American merchants. The Germans, on the other hand, were engaged in unrestricted submarine warfare. Again, this was a relatively new technological development. We've seen submarines in one form or fashion all the way back to the Civil War, but by World War I, they were capable of cruising in the high seas and the oceans with some effectiveness. And unrestricted submarine warfare simply means that the Germans felt free to sink any and all ships that they thought might be aiding and abetting their enemies. And so this led to a number of American ships being sunk by German submarines. Americans found this kind of warfare barbaric. You might think back to some of the earlier wars in world and American history. You think back to the Revolutionary War, and soldiers would sort of line up against each other in the open, and may the best side win. Now, in part, it was the American willingness to engage in guerrilla warfare that broke with those traditions that helped to win that war. But this was something that had not been seen before. The sneakiness, the deviousness of those German submarines lurking beneath the surface unseen, and then rising to the surface only quick enough to launch an attack and send a torpedo at its enemy, and then going back under the water. It was a very sneaky and devious way to wage a war, and many Americans turned against the Germans for their willingness to fight this way. But it was one attack in particular, the attack on the British luxury liner, the Lusitania, which occurred in May of 1915, that really turned the opinions of many Americans against the Germans. The Lusitania was the fastest and most glamorous luxury liner of its era. And this was a British luxury ship. It had cruised across the Atlantic a couple of times, and on this particular voyage was sailing from New York back to England. There was a lot of concern about sailing on the high seas at this time. The Germans had made it publicly known that they were engaged in unrestricted submarine warfare, and that they would sink any ship that they thought they needed to. In fact, passengers who boarded the Lusitania would have been hard-pressed to avoid warnings and notices, much like the one you see there on your screen. And I'm certain that many of the passengers on the Lusitania or other ships would have felt very uneasy about traveling the seas at that time. Nonetheless, most people would have found it hard to believe that the Germans could sink such a prominent luxury liner as this. And yet, a German U-boat captain or submarine captain spotted the Lusitania just as it was approaching the English Channel and put a torpedo into its side. The Lusitania went down in the seas, and about 1,200 passengers were killed in this attack. And you see the dramatic rendering of what this attack might have looked like there in the picture at the bottom. Among those killed were 128 Americans as well. And you can imagine the outcry that this created in the United States. And just consider if something like this were to happen today. Any foreign nation attacking an airplane or a ship or something with 128 Americans killed. There would have been great call for an American response. And there was at that time as well, and Woodrow Wilson was feeling pressure from the American people to declare war against Germany at that time. And I think this is perhaps the key moment when we look back to Wilson's childhood, his experience with the Civil War, and simply the thought that war is such a horrible thing. He did not want to get the United States tangled up in this war. But there's more to be said about the Lusitania as well, and that is that the Germans knew that secretly, below the hold, below decks, the Lusitania was in fact carrying ammunition and war supplies for the British. It was carrying war goods, and the Germans had intelligence indicating that the Lusitania was loaded up with these wartime goods. And so that now the public was not aware of this at that time, so this is kind of a debate and discussion among historians looking back with this knowledge. It adds a layer to the discussion. Were the Germans justified in sinking what appeared to be an innocent luxury liner, a cruise ship, that in fact was carrying war goods to the other side? And this is a debate that has gripped historians from then to now, wondering whether the British and the Americans hadn't made a terrible mistake in their own right by putting that ammunition on board. In the immediate context, however, the Lusitania did have one very dramatic effect at that time, and that is that it swung almost unanimously the American public opinion in support of the British, even though they don't know about the ammunition that was below the decks. The Germans at this point are viewed as just an unconscionable, evil, devious enemy, and American opinion now swings around in support of the British, even if we remain neutral after the attack on the Lusitania. The following year, Woodrow Wilson was re-elected as president in the 1916 presidential election. His platform was based largely on the idea that he had kept the United States out of war. And as you see in the picture here, a campaign truck for Woodrow Wilson during the 1916 presidential campaign. And you see several of the references to the idea that Wilson maintained neutrality and kept us out of the war. In fact, one of the statements there, who keeps us out of war? And again, in some ways it might have been an easy choice to join the war after the attack on the Lusitania. But Wilson didn't, and so he wins re-election on this platform, the idea that the United States is going to remain neutral and going to remain out of the war. And yet, even at that time, Woodrow Wilson privately complained to the Secretary of the Navy. He said, "I can't keep this country out of war. They talk of me as though I were a god. Any little German lieutenant can put us into the war at any time by some calculated outrage." And so he seems to be referencing here an attack like the Lusitania, another attack like this, and it would have been impossible for the United States to remain neutral. And so Wilson wins re-election in 1916 based largely on this promise to keep America out of the war. And yet it is less than 6 months later that the United States, in fact, did declare war. It's April of 1917. So what happened within this space of just a couple of months that completely changed Wilson and America's stance on neutrality? Well, there are a number of important developments in the war itself, one of which is the crumbling of Russia. And we will come back and talk more about the Russian Revolution at a later juncture. But it's in the midst of World War I that Russia essentially crumbled unto itself and fell into revolution. And so Russia abandoned the war. And so now the Germans were no longer fighting the two-front war that they had been engaged in before. And so the Germans decided to make one last attempt to win the war quickly. They resumed their unrestricted submarine warfare in February of 1917, and once again began to occasionally ensnare American shipping in the process of attacking almost everything on the high seas. Now, the Germans understood that a policy like this might bring the United States into the war, and so they were taking something of a calculated gamble here. Their thought was, even if the United States grew so outraged that they decided to declare war, that it would take several months, perhaps 6 months or more, before the United States could raise an army, muster troops, train them, get all of the weaponry prepared to really make an impact in the war. And so, while we know in hindsight that this gamble did not work out for the Germans, we can also see that in some ways it's a logical and perhaps reasonable risk that they were taking to try to end the war, because it would take the United States several months to really make an impact on the war. Another event that occurs in this time that helped to push the United States into the war was known as the Zimmermann telegram. And this was a letter that was intercepted by actually British intelligence in February of 1917, February 24th of 1917. This was a letter that was sent from a man named Zimmermann, who was the German foreign minister, to his emissary in Mexico. And so, oddly enough, this is a letter from the Germans to the Mexicans. And what Zimmermann suggested in this letter was that if Mexico joined the war effort against the United States, that the Germans would help Mexico regain the territories that they had lost to the United States in the Mexican-American War. This is back in the 1840s. And so places like Arizona and New Mexico and parts of California would actually be given back to the Mexicans. This letter was intercepted by British intelligence, and it was released to the media and created a bombshell in the press. The American people were outraged by this, and again, it's further evidence of the depths that the Germans were willing to sink in order to win this war. The unrestricted submarine warfare, the Zimmermann telegram, the perhaps gloomy prognosis on the fate of Britain and France as the war continued. These are all things that eventually forced the United States into the war. And on April 6th, 1917, Wilson read his war message before Congress, declaring war on Germany. His speech was met with thunderous applause, and yet as he left the stage, Woodrow Wilson was heard to say, "Don't they understand? They've just asked me to send American men to die."